I think in the end, but it's a close call, but I think in the end, the world trading system will go forward without the United States, basically. That the end of all of this is U.S. isolation with the rest of the world basically continuing along, even the formal rules of the World Trade Organization. Trump has something quite different in mind, which is that the U.S. remains at the center of the power and the center of the system, and even that, and they've been quite explicit about this, that other countries will fall into line with the United States against China. So not merely fall into line with the U.S., but will actually join the trade war against China. No doubt that is a major goal in Washington right now, at least of some of this administration and much of the political scene. There's an overwhelming anti-China vision in Washington, and the idea that other countries will join against China is their hope. The reason I think it's not likely is that if you take a hard look at what real economic power the United States still maintains, it's nowhere close to what Trump believes. Trump's idea is that the U.S. market is so central to every economy that basically the leverage that the United States gets over the threat of cutting other countries out of the U.S. is enough to get them to do America's foreign policy bidding. That may have been true 25 years ago. I think it's an anachronistic view today. And the reason is simply the numbers. The U.S. imports are just not big enough for most countries to say that they're going to shift their whole foreign policy and economic orientation because of a U.S. threat. And I also believe that Trump's...
Maybe except Germany, right? Maybe except Germany. Germany is so dependent on the U.S. market, unlike other countries.
So there are countries clearly where this is the case. And Mexico is an example of this, or Canada is an example of this. I mean, of course, they can say what they want, but in the end, they have 70% of their exports going to the U.S. market. And so there are countries like that, but there aren't many countries like that, actually. The U.S. as a whole in its imports is roughly 12 or 13% of worldwide imports. The market is not big enough. The idea that has been floating around recently is that as the U.S. blocks China, China will flood Europe with its goods. And by doing so, Europe will put up barriers and effectively have to join the U.S. in an anti-China move. If you look at those numbers, it's actually not the case. China exports right now about $450 billion a year to the United States. It's not so big. By the way, it's come down a lot because there's been 10 years of anti-China policies, even starting with Obama, but during Trump 1 and during Biden. So China's already diversified substantially. So that kind of idea that China's about to flood the world with its inexpensive products and thereby provoke a worldwide anti-China response, that too is not true. So I admit it's a debatable point, but I don't think the U.S. has the power to do this. Another point about the power in this in this trade war, the financial markets really are shaky right now, and it's understandable. The U.S. is a debtor country at a significant scale, and it's a deficit country at a significant scale, meaning not only does it owe a lot, but it borrows a lot. And you don't get to call the shots so easily as Trump believes when you are a debtor. And that's why he had to quickly abandon the so-called reciprocal tariffs, which were absolutely I won't even go into it. But anyway, that whole tariff list that Trump made, which was completely primitive, He had to abandon it, not because of protests about trade, but because the capital markets started to seize up and the U.S. interest rates started to rise above 5%. And clearly there was a significant problem. Trump does not have a strong hand. He's playing poker, if I can come back to our earlier discussion. Poker is a game of bullshitting others. It's a game of bluff as much as it is a game of a strong hand. So I personally think he's very much overestimating his hand. Now, as soon as this started, President Xi Jinping went to Southeast Asia, and he's still on that trip, and he's going to be visiting Malaysia, I think, quite soon, and I think in May, and on and on. China's not going to lose its trade relations. I spoke with senior African officials today. They're so focused on China and all that China relations can mean. I just don't see it. The United States, in my view, really is in relative terms, a diminishing force in the world. It is not the sole superpower. It is not the indispensable country. And Biden bet that it was in a particular way in Ukraine. Trump is betting in a quite different way that it is in the world economy. I don't buy it in either case. And now China is talking openly about internationalizing the renminbi. I think it's inevitable for many, many reasons. And that also means that the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar as being the sole world key currency, I don't give it 10 years of continued life. So that's my basic point. I think it's a poker bet that isn't going to win by the US.
Can I put a hypothesis to you for you to comment? It simply adds to everything you said, because I happen to agree. Look, the hegemony of the United States, based, not despite, but based on its deficits. This is the great paradox of the last 50 years. Hegemony based on deficits is hanging by a thread, and the thread is the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. So the internationalization of the renminbi is going to be what really severs that thread. And the reason why it hasn't happened yet is because Beijing has not decided to do it.
That's correct.
My hypothesis is this: if Trump continues to push them, then would it not make sense for Beijing to turn the BRICS, not just from a loose agglomeration with an alternative to SWIFT, which they have already created with BRICS Pay based on a remarkable blockchain technology, but to actually imitate the Bretton Woods system with the renminbi playing the role that the dollar did to anchor this alternative, new Bretton Woods system. Because people say to me that can't happen when you have capital controls. Well, it did under Bretton Woods. You can have a system where you have a surplus country at its heart. It was the United States in 1944. It could be China today, with capital controls, with certain constraints which allow for Beijing to maintain control over its financial sector, not to throw open the gates. And that, for me, would be the greatest danger for the exorbitant privilege of the dollar.
Well, I think, first of all, China is opening the gates to some extent, but carefully. And what's really key, the most fundamental point, I would say, is Chinese interest rates, both the nominal interest rates and real inflation-adjusted interest rates, are lower than U.S. interest rates. Well, China's a saving surplus country. The U.S. is a deficit country. But you get a lot of power by financing the world. The U.S. financed the world for a long time in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. China is financing the world. It's financing enterprise, it's financing infrastructure, and it is creating a renminbi-based outward-oriented finance. And just today, I was reading about new steps that the Chinese government is taking to say we support the outward investments of Chinese companies, especially, I would say, in the Southeast Asian region, to start with the 10 ASEAN countries. They're close by. There's a lot of natural connection. That's where President Xi Jinping has been on his visits recently. So, yes, I think that this is a big deal. And I would say that the exorbitant privilege of the dollar will come to an end for three fundamental reasons. And we're watching it right now. One is simply the weight of the US in the world in relative terms is shrinking. So the predominance of the dollar at some fundamental level depends on the strength of the US economy, and the rise of China's, but not just China, of India and others, is a fundamental change. And that share is declining when measured in purchasing power in a significant way, and it will continue to do so. Second, the US completely abused the privilege of being the world's key currency in a couple of ways. One is by, total failure of fiscal responsibility, because you need a measure of fiscal responsibility to show that you're not just blowing up the whole monetary system, and the US doesn't show it right now. But second is in all of the use of the dollar to enforce US foreign policy. The weaponization of the dollar has been pervasive. And part of it is simply grabbing Russia's foreign exchange reserves, for example, grabbing Venezuela's foreign exchange reserves, grabbing Iran's reserves, Afghanistan's reserves. It's a bad act. When countries watch this long enough, it tells you don't keep your money in dollars. So they're getting that. But second, and it's similarly important quantitatively, the US used the dollar for enforcement of sanctions, which is different from just grabbing dollars. They threaten third countries. If you don't go along with our sanctions, we cut your banks out of the SWIFT system. So that is pissing off dozens of countries around the world in a very serious way. And then the third point that I think is absolutely also true, SWIFT is a primitive clearing system at this point. And so in a digital age, just the sheer technology of clearing doesn't have to go through commercial banks the way it did. It will, in some fundamental sense, be a central bank digital currency, although there are many different models of that. And this also will accelerate the move, certainly out of SWIFT. But the Fed isn't doing anything interesting on digital currencies either, whereas the People's Bank of China absolutely is. So I agree with you.
Can I include that?
Yes.
To that very point, because in my last book, I was making this point. So effectively, it's a fourth reason, a fourth threat to the exorbitant privilege of the dollar. In China, you have the complete and seamless merging of what I call cloud capital, that is algorithmic capital, and finance. You have WeChat, and as mentioned, very importantly, the digital currency of the central bank. Now, why don't you have that in the United States? It's not because they're not capable of doing it. It's because Wall Street won't allow it.
Exactly.
Wall Street will allow Silicon Valley to share into its financial rents. So, because of the political structure in China, that's not in question. I mean, they do things in China that would never happen in the West, like, for instance, impose interoperability on their big tech conglomerates and so on.
By the way,
so when you bring together
100% correct, 100% correct. And by the way, interestingly, what are they doing in Washington? They're playing games with crypto rather than digital central bank currency. So they're even undermining the dollar by turning to crypto, because that's the game of the campaign financiers. So it's crazy. In other words, they're eating up their own base deliberately.
So let's go back to the question that one of our viewers from China asked before we go to a viewer from Portugal. Remember, the question was, well, if Trump feels that his bluff is being called and his bluster is failing, do you fear, Professor Sachs, that's a question that came from China, that they will intensify the tensions in Taiwan, possibly station missiles there in order to provoke the Chinese government to intervene in order to blow everything up rather than lose the exorbitant privilege of the dollar? That's essentially what our viewer has been asking.
let me say, whether they do it for that reason or for other geopolitical reasons, everything the United States does with Taiwan is playing with conflagration. It's playing not just with fire, it's playing with disaster. And it's very similar to Ukraine, very similar, because the idea of Ukraine was the United States can do what it wants vis-a-vis Ukraine, because what can Russia do? And this, by the way, going back, we talked about Brzezinski. Brzezinski actually writes in 1997 a long section of his book on the grand chessboard, where he says, he analyzes what can Russia do as NATO enlarges. And he says, in the end, nothing. They're going to have to accept it. Okay, this was yet another blunder of American strategy, and it's very clearly written back in 1997. Now, when it comes to Taiwan, the United States, for many, many reasons, geostrategic, gamesmanship with China, military considerations in an idea that goes back to John Foster Dulles in 1951, the first island chain. We must prevent China from having a breakout to the Pacific. Mind-boggling stuff. They really think that they're gearing up towards a possible war over Taiwan. And if the Taiwanese act like the Ukrainians, there will be a devastating war. And what I mean by acting like the Ukrainians, if the Taiwanese politicians say, America's got our back, we declare independence, there will be a war, no question. So whether the United States provokes the war directly, which I think is less likely, or the United States acts in a way which could cause Taiwanese politicians to be reckless in their own country's situation, like the Ukrainians were, saying, yeah, we love NATO, we're going to do whatever we want to defeat Russia. If the Taiwanese behave that way, there will be war. What can one say about this? Well, I'll just say two things. I'll say, yeah, two main things. First, every war game that has been played and every bit of common sense is that the United States gets defeated in a conventional war, thousands of miles from the U.S. coast. It's crazy idea of the United States that they're going to fight a war with China in China's waters. Okay, this is the first point. Second point is such a war could lead to global annihilation. And that's not hyperbole. That's just also common sense. This is crazy stuff. So I come back to the point that Americans are pretty crazy. They're capable of doing crazy things. It's a militarized society. Trump, I don't know what he knows or wants, but Washington is filled with people talking about war with China. And anyone that talks that way is out of their minds and is really doing profound harm to let's say, the expected future of our planet. And so I hope we never come to that, because it would be certainly a disaster for the United States and most likely a world disaster.